actually managers are really important and they have a really big leverage on the performance of their team.
Or
But
management is really important.
management, yeah, the skills of
Yeah.
management, yeah, and somebody possessing the skills, which we might call a manager.
Today we're talking about safe to challenge, and we're going to look at the history behind that phrase. It's a pretty commonly used phrase in contemporary organizations, but there's a load of research behind it, and often actually the term safe to challenge can be mishandled, mistreated, misunderstood. So the plan today is to go back into a bit of the history and bring us right up to the present day. It's a concept that emerged in the 1960s, and then it became popularized by the work of a Harvard academic, Amy Edmondson, towards the end of the 90s and into the 2000s. And it was brought to the attention of the kind of tech industry and the modern workforce, and arguably popularized by a project from Google called Project Aristotle, which identified the importance of psychological safety for organizations. So we're going to dig into that background and the research. We're going to talk about Google's Aristotle project. We're going to look at some modern applications and tools for using psychological safety. And we're going to finish off on coming back around to that idea of the concept of safe to challenge and why it can be a bit tricky to foster psychological safety to lead to safety to challenge in modern organizations. Mark, when we first met, I remember we talked about team psychological safety, and I remember going, "This guy knows about psychological safety. He's a keeper." it's something that you had kind of had to get to grips with in your work, wasn't it?
It definitely was. And what I'm hoping we can do in this episode is really run through how I heard about it, because I came to it relatively late with with a new generation of certainly of managers that were learning about it. And obviously we all thought that we'd invented it, or actually we all thought that Google had invented it. So I think today we can talk a lot about what a big part Google had to play in introducing that to this sort of new generation of organizations. But actually, I think it's also really important, and especially because you have a lot of the background in where that came from. That concept was popularized probably 15 years before Google started talking about it, and I think particularly with Amy Edmondson, I knew everything that Google had said and latched onto that and felt there was a lot of confirmation bias. These are the things that I feel are true. Google is saying the same thing. They've got a lot of evidence that demonstrates this is what we should be doing with our organizations. But actually, I think there's a lot more to it if you go back and dig into the research past just what Google say. And I think actually we see a bit of a trap with psychological safety in the modern workforce of it just being another checkbox exercise where people are saying we need that because Google have said it's important, without really thinking about what that actually means inside the organization.
Precisely. Let's start with a definition. I'm going to travel back in time from the definition, but I think in case people listening have never heard of this term psychological safety before, let's talk about what it means. And broadly speaking, it is the shared belief that the team, or indeed an individual, is safe for interpersonal risk taking. I say the team or the individual because it started off as an individual psychological concept, and probably the thing that led it to become such a widely used and referred to concept in contemporary organizations was Amy Edmondson's work, where she developed it into a concept that allows us to understand team performance. So it's the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking, and those interpersonal risks are things like the risk of looking ignorant, the risk of looking incompetent, the risk of being seen as intrusive, or the risk of being seen as negative. I'm going to put a pin in that, but it's just so we know what we're talking about. It's that feeling of vulnerability when you're sticking your head above the parapet or speaking up in an organization.
It's definitely one of those things that a team feels it when it's there, but might not know exactly how to describe it. But really, I think the key thing is the feeling that you are free to disagree, or that you are free to say something stupid, and that you won't be punished for that. And there can be engagement with it in that situation, that people can give you feedback, but it's that you are not, you're not held to account, or your performance is questioned, or your capability is questioned. And I think that's really important. And so it's one of those interesting things. You can see it in teams, but it's really hard to tell them exactly how it manifests itself and the things that they should be doing to see it.
The concept of risk and safety, I think, are useful to hold on to as well, because
Yeah,
I mean they're sort of very functional words, but we're talking about safety and risk at to a large extent an emotional level, and I totally know what you mean when you say the term psychological safety. It sounds very academic.
yeah,
Um, I always shorthand it with, it's, if you want to think of a phrase that represents psychological safety, it's speaking up.
yeah,
Are you safe? Do you feel secure around the people with whom you work to speak up about stuff? Now, it's not only that, but that's a good shorthand. And so psychological safety underpins that sense of security and speaking up. Where we end up with talking about being safe to challenge, that is all about speaking up. It started arguably in the 1960s. It had a bit of a kind of preceding gestation phase, let's call it, with the work of Carl Rogers. So psychological safety comes from a sort of psychological therapeutic background, because Carl Rogers' work was all about the patient therapist relationship. And, you know, reducing it to a couple of sentences, really what that work I identified was, in order for a therapy dynamic between a therapist and a patient to go well, there needed to be this sense of security developed by the therapist in order for the treatment to be successful for the patient. He didn't actually use the term psychological safety. So that's why I say it was a sort of gestation period. He had this term of unconditional positive regard. But Carl Rogers then did a lot of work with the people who are largely credited with coming up with the concept of psychological safety, Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis, in the 1960s. And indeed, Carl Rogers actually, he did work alongside them. He published chapters in books that they edited. So you had Carl Rogers, you had Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis in the 1960s, uh, directly and indirectly collaborating over this emergent concept of psychological safety. A lot of what Edgar Schein's work is concerned with is about people's propensity to engage with organizational change, and psychological safety being an important part of creating the kind of fertile ground to successfully achieve organizational change.
yeah,
Then we get to 1996, and this is the bit of the history that I love. I love this story of this paper, and Amy Edmondson is, she's just a monster academic in terms of what she's contributed in this area. It's had such a great impact, and actually, it wasn't in business; it was in healthcare
yeah,
where she made these findings, and the way in which that has been understood to translate to lots of kind of high safety, high reliability environments: healthcare, aviation, space, nuclear, construction. But her original sort of seminal paper, if you like, 1996, the cool story about it is she was studying nurses and she was looking at psychological safety. She was interested in the concept of psychological safety. It wasn't an accident that she came across this, but she was looking at nursing teams. And what she found, broad strokes, was, well, she had the teams that demonstrated really high levels of psychological safety, willing to speak up, willing to take interpersonal risks, willing to look silly, willing to criticize, willing to express dissent. But these teams seem to be doing worse. So these
yeah,
teams were making more mistakes. And this was odd to her. She was thinking, well, surely the teams that exhibit high levels of psychological safety do better.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a bit like, you know, the levels of crime and the levels of reported crime. The thing she was actually seeing was that psychologically safe teams report more mistakes because they feel safe to do so.
Yeah.
And this was not necessarily a completely unknown idea, but she had this perfectly evidenced demonstration of how it happens, why it happens, and the differences between the profiles of the teams that demonstrate those differences. And that was really a big light bulb thing. It was okay, so if you have high levels of psychological safety, the people in the teams feel comfortable admitting their mistakes, calling out errors, and making sure they're reported. The ones that are not psychologically safe are covering up errors. They're not making the errors, they're scared to report them.
Yeah.
And of course, you'd hope in a hospital setting that wouldn't be happening. What it meant was she was particularly interested in drug administration or drug selection error. So the dosage was wrong, or even the drug used was incorrect. When that happened, was it diligently logged and reported and shared to try to improve? You mentioned learning. This is a big part of it. The paper is called "Learning from Mistakes." Or when someone made a mistake, did they try and find a way of burying the fact that it happened? So that this suddenly became the kind of shorthand in a technical sense for demonstrating whether you had psychological safety or not, and that led to an amazing body of work on psychological safety. And as I said already, psychological safety in teams. So the thing about
Yeah.
this work was this was taking place at a team level. And if I can dig into a little bit of the technical kind of academic detail, because this is actually important from the point of view of, I think, another thing that is often conflated, if we can say that, it's not a grave error, but people quite often conflate trust with psychological safety. Psychological safety is just basically trust. Like if we trust each other, it's all fine. And Edmondson does a really good job of distinguishing between what trust is and what psychological safety is, and the slight subtleties of difference. Now, she talks a lot about trust, and she will, I'm sure, would be the first to say, well, you can't really develop effective levels of psychological safety without trust, but psychological safety is nonetheless different.
Yeah.
And actually, in Scott Tannenbaum, Eduardo Salas's book Teams That Work, they've got a really good way of summarizing what Edmondson means. So they say that trust is giving the other person the benefit of the doubt, and psychological safety is believing that others will give you the benefit of the doubt. Amy Edmondson's technical definition of this is the object of focus. So, distinguishing from trust, it's about who is acting and who holds the beliefs about those actions. So, trust is giving the other person the benefit of the doubt, and psychological safety is believing that others will give you the benefit of the doubt.
Something I wanted to jump in quickly with there, which
Sure.
is because we've looked at trust before, and actually some of the evolutionary anthropology roots of trust in humans. I think there's something that I've observed, especially in the research that looks at this, and then looking at the the growth of human societies and sort of the processes around getting teams and groups to work. Trust was this concept, this observable characteristic, which was really important when you had very small groups working together. So in very early days, you needed to demonstrate trust even to be in a team. So part of forming a team at a very basic level, you are expecting that somebody is not going to be antagonistic towards you. We're going to create this team. I trust you. We've got a shared goal. I trust you not to steal whatever chunk of the goal that we get is. You're going to do right by me at the end. And trust is something which is relatively easy to create between two individuals, but gets much harder as you scale. And so you almost need a replacement for trust as you get bigger. And there's lots of controls against that, because instead of having trust between two individuals, you start having rules and controls and balances within the group. So the norms that exist. And we've talked about ways that groups will actually look at social loafing, and respond against that if they feel like somebody isn't performing. So, and I know this is an oversimplification, but sometimes I think about the concept of psychological safety being trust at scale, because you can't really trust a group. You can trust another person, and individually you build that trust one to one. Psychological safety is kind of believing that within that group environment, you can trust that you will not be judged for some of those activities. So speaking up, making a recommendation, saying something that might appear stupid, and so there's this sense that I get when you see this in a group, that you're trying to build out trust at scale, and that's really what you're demonstrating with psychological safety.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And Edmondson says herself in her work, if you and I were in a bigger team together, I might trust you, but there might not be any psychological safety in the team.
Yeah,
So trust can exist in the absence of psychological safety, but trust doesn't replace psychological safety
yeah,
at the team level. And that is the other part of the dimensions that she's very keen to point out, is it's about the group level of analysis. So it's an aggregate held belief at the team level. It isn't it isn't owned. It doesn't. An individual doesn't have property rights over the psychological safety of a team. They all contribute to it. They all pay into it, and that's what's interesting. The kind of two-sided coin about psychological safety is, yes, it's the safety to take interpersonal risks. So when I act, it's that I can count on the fact that people will give me the benefit of the doubt.
yeah,
But the way that I act when I act is also contributing to the way others feel about the psychological safety in the team. So
yeah,
there's constantly a two-way street between your perception of how you feel as a result of your actions, and indeed how are those actions contributing to how others feel. But it's a team level aggregate held view. So it exists at the group level of analysis, which, as you say, trust tends to be more of a kind of dyadic thing between perhaps two people, or it's identifiable among different individuals within a group.
yeah,
The other thing, final aspect of the dimensions that I think is really interesting, she talks about time frame. So the sense of psychological safety's existence is experienced in these really narrow interactions. And it's so powerful that it can completely undermine logic and common sense and higher reasoning. And what I mean by that is, you go back to that nursing example, the teams that were not reporting a lot of the mistakes, that had low levels of psychological safety, the sense of threat. So in those situations, you're talking about, well, maybe you gave a patient the wrong drug, which could
yeah,
endanger their life. Well, the problem with the time frame of psychological safety, this really constrained time frame, is when I feel a lack of psychological safety, the impact that has on me as an individual is so strong that I would rather protect myself. It's not conscious necessarily. I would rather protect myself from that that sort of sense of suffering that you get when you feel that. I would rather do that than protect the patient.
yeah,
That it sort of warps your feeling. And the
yeah,
best example is from aviation, because psychological safety is a big part of crew resource management, which is a safety feature of behavior within aviation, to make pilots operate as safely as possible. And Korean Air had a litany of fatal disasters in the late 90s, and a lot of it came down to psychological safety between captain and first officer. But the amazing thing is that you couldn't get a more potent example, because the first officer in some of these, the cockpit recordings, the first officer is essentially in order to protect themselves from the apparent suffering of a lack of psychological safety, will not say something, even though the consequences are the terminal suffering of death.
Yeah.
That's how powerful a lack of psychological safety is. You are essentially choosing death over the discomfort of speaking up in the moment.
Edmondson, in her book Teaming, which I know has it carries a lot of the earlier research
Yeah.
into it, but there is a particular example which stood out, and I'm just trying to make sure that I've got the actual quote, because she talks about the Columbia disaster, and she
Yep.
talks about
Space
team
shuttle. Yeah.
psychological safety inside the group that was responding to the potential disaster on the re-entry. So in Mission Control, there was an engineer, Rodney Rocher, a shuttle engineer, and he had requested images of the shuttle wing, and so he expressed the need for these satellite images in an email to his superior, and he found out that he was unlikely to get anything back. The request was unlikely to be honored. So he wrote an email which said, "Remember the NASA safety poster everywhere around stating if it's not safe, say so." So, in theory, it's safe to challenge inside NASA. And so he goes on, "Yes, it's that serious." He didn't send the email to the mission manager. He only shared it with his fellow engineers. That safety has a very distinct hierarchical level. And then later he said the engineers were often told not to send messages much higher than their own rung in the ladder. But then later he was in a television interview with ABC News, and in that interview he was asked why he didn't voice his doubts about the safety. So talking about an engineer that had a real belief, because he was an expert on that particular part of the shuttle. He had a real belief that there was an issue. Why didn't you express your doubts? He said, I just couldn't do it. I'm too low down. And and by she means the mission manager, team leader, Linda Ham, is way up here, gesturing with his hand held above his head. So it's exactly that. And it's really interesting how it's sort of easy to think that team psychological safety is amongst one strata of a team,
Yeah.
but actually it has to be demonstrated across hierarchical levels. It's not just me and my peers. If I say something silly, my peers aren't going to criticize me, but it's often much harder when it crosses hierarchical levels.
And that's one of the things that Edmondson talks about as a consequence of establishing psychological safety is boundary spanning.
Yeah,
And that might be boundary spanning from a hierarchical point of view, like it was in the case of the Columbia shuttle disaster, or it might be boundary spanning across teams. So it may still be at a kind of horizontal direction of travel, but you don't know people, you're unfamiliar with the way they work, you might not speak the same kind of technical language as them. But if you have psychological safety, you feel supported and encouraged to cross boundaries, and you feel secure that there won't be that sense of being admonished, rebuked, penalized for doing so. In those cases, these famous cases where it's so useful to look into where it went wrong, it's quite often about that speaking up thing. But
yeah,
and indeed, perhaps, as we'll come on to talk about with challenging the status quo, but it could be as simple as asking for help. Psychological safety is not just about the big things where you think something's wrong and you need to blow the whistle, or you need to you need to challenge a kind of prevailing view of senior people or superiors. It might just be a case of asking for help. It might be asking for help from a colleague. So
yeah.
it can be quite low level safety as well as these quite high profile things.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think there is a stigma attached. People feel a stigma attached to saying that they don't know how to do something, or saying that they're overwhelmed, because they feel like the implications of that is they're saying either I can't cope with the work, I'm not good enough, or I don't have the skills or the capability to do this, and it feeds an internal narrative. I'm not good enough to be here. And one of the things, and I know that Edmondson talked about this specifically, is it, just like trust. It's one of those things you can't just snap your fingers and create in an organization. It has to constantly be demonstrated. but it also has to really be demonstrated, as we saw from that Columbia example, has to be demonstrated from the management level
Yeah.
through the hierarchy down. Because it's one thing to trust an individual colleague that they won't make fun of you. You can ask for help. But it's another thing within the group to say that everybody around me is not going to judge me if I say, I don't know how to do this. I'm feeling overwhelmed and I need help. I've got too much on my plate and I could do with some assistance.
Something that quite often needs to be highlighted whenever you're getting into a conversation about the practicalities of psychological safety. So team psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's concept, group level of analysis. It's a concept entirely founded upon the idea of a group dynamic, a team dynamic. But the proportionate impact of effective leadership within setting team psychological safety can't be overstated. The ability to set team psychological safety lives and dies by effective leadership.
Yeah.
So pivotal. But tell me about Google.
Psychological safety probably popped up on my radar probably around 2016. So the background to this, Google have always been an organization that has really focused on how to be more productive, how to support people inside their organization, and that really started in the sort of mid 2000s with a project called Project Oxygen, which we're not going to talk about too much. But effectively, Project Oxygen was really interesting because the tech bro founders of Google at one point had said, we don't need managers, we just need brilliant programmers and it'll be fine, which is probably a belief that I had around the same time that they had it. It's like, if we just fill a room with brilliant engineers, everything will be great. And in very brief, what Oxygen did is said, actually, managers are really important and they have a really big leverage on the performance of their team.
Or
But by
management is really important.
management, yeah, the skills of
Yeah.
management, yeah, and somebody possessing the skills, which we might call a manager. But yeah, and it's hard, and it is different from being an engineer. It's not just something that you do on the side. And I'm sure we'll come back to Oxygen at some point, because that was quite groundbreaking, and it sort of drew people's managers' attentions, especially in this new digital economy when people didn't know how to work. It was so we've spoken about VUCA before, this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous
Yeah.
environment that the digital revolution brought with it. Suddenly things moving much faster. Everybody was looking around at that period, looking to see how people were doing better. And obviously Google was a big success story, even through the early 2000s. But by about 2012, Google had moved on to another project, Aristotle. And it was called Aristotle because it's the team being greater than the sum of its parts.
The
So that
famous
was
Aristotelian quote.
right.
Aristotle had it on his LinkedIn, I think.
He did. That
Yeah.
was that was his bio. I still forget which one was which, Oxygen and Aristotle, but Oxygen being the managers are the oxygen that fuels the team, and Aristotle being the team is greater than some of its parts. So Google did this research, and it wasn't a one-off. It followed on from what Oxygen had done, and that was published. So they were actually very, very open with the work that they had done. And I originally thought, as we were talking about this, I thought that I had come across the psychological safety from the Google point of view from Laszlo Bock's book, which we've talked about before. So Laszlo Bock's book, Work Rules, that was published in 2015. Laszlo Bock was the VP of People Operations at Google. So he ran the team that was running Aristotle. But actually, interestingly, there's no mention of Aristotle in the Work Rules book. There's only mention of Oxygen. So he's actually talking about a lot of the things that we would sort of recognize from this Googleian approach to management, but he wasn't talking about it. I was quite surprised. And then I realized that actually there was this overlap. So Aristotle had started in 2012, which is probably about when Laszlo Bock was starting work on the Work Rules book.
Yeah, on the book.
But it
Yeah.
only really, the project only really came to public attention. It was one of Laszlo Bock's team published the findings of Aristotle in late 2015, November 2015. But it was an interview, New York Times interview or publication, that really brought Google's research into psychological safety into the public zeitgeist. So that the article really talked about, made public all the findings of Aristotle, And what Aristotle was doing was, if you have a team, how do you really make that team perform better?
Yeah.
And although we now, it's very easy to say, here's Aristotle, it talked about psychological safety. Actually, the findings that Google had were, there are 5 things that make teams perform better. So if you want a really, really effective teams, there are these 5 things that you can focus on to make sure that exist within that team that are going to really help. Psychological safety was the first. And what was quite interesting is, it was, yeah, it's a little bit academic still. When you're talking about psychological safety, it's not necessarily something that an average person in an average team is going to, understand. And back then it was a new concept. So today, and partly because of Aristotle and Google and the New York Times article, it's become popularized. And so where I think we'll talk about in a little while is, now almost any technical team, engineering team, software development team will start talking about psychological safety. But really what they're talking about is what Google talked about with Aristotle. I think on my journey, I'd come across at least some of the basics of it by picking up what Laszlo Bock was doing in Work Rules, and then watching, because I'd seen Oxygen, and then obviously that became Aristotle. So I was consuming all of these things out of academia, in practice, looking at them. So Google released the findings, and still talk about it today. They have a site, or sort of a theme of Google rework, and so you can
Yeah.
go and Google rework, and they talk a lot about the findings, both of Oxygen and Aristotle. But there were 5 things that Aristotle found. It wasn't just psychological safety. So just in being fair to Google, they had these 5, with the top of the pile being psychological safety.
Because it was psychological safety in terms of statistical significance, it was the thing that had the most disproportionately positive impact on the performance of a team.
Exactly right. They described it as, team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. I think that language is really clear and people can understand it, and I think it's a great definition. The other 4, just for completeness, were dependability. Team members get things done on time and meet Google's high bar for excellent. Structure and clarity. Team members have clear roles, plans, and goals. Meaning, work is personally important to the team members, and impact. So team members think their work matters, and create change. So all of those things tie up with a lot of the things that we have talked about. So the sort of the autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Yeah.
So people feeling that their work is important, having clear goals, and some of these things are integral to a team being a
Yeah.
team, and a lot of that comes back through communication. But I think it was significant that at the top of the pile, psychological safety, this behavior, this observed behavior, was the biggest thing that had an impact on teams.
And I think it's a timing thing, but it did mention growth mindset, which I find fascinating as another uh, psychological concept that has gained deservedly great traction.
So that there was actually, I think the thing that I found interesting, and with growth mindset, a lot of that popularized by Matthew Syed, and sort of in Black Box Thinking, and some of the other work that he had, brought it to a much wider audience. Thinking that understanding this concept of a growth mindset, of being able to be open to change and challenge, is really interesting. A lot of our listeners will have heard of the work of Carol Dweck on growth mindset, or read Matthew Syed books, and be familiar with that concept, of which sounds really similar, on the face of it. I think growth mindset and psychological safety, they overlap in a lot of ways. What I found really interesting is, just as Laszlo Bock had talked about what Google were doing to create this environment of growth and adaptability. And again, that goes back to what Amy Edmondson was saying, you need psychological safety to be able to adapt quickly. You need to become a learning organization. Obviously, the work that Carol Dweck did on growth mindset was really similar to that. Satya Nadella wrote a book on how he had been handed Carol Dweck's book, read it, I think by his wife, gave him the book, and then thought, this is so powerful and so important, I'm going to align the whole of Microsoft around the growth mindset. And literally his
Right.
book
Okay.
hit refresh, which was 2017, so a little bit later, his book was how he had sent out the edicts within Microsoft that we are going to be an organization with a growth mindset. And again, I find this sort of movement between an individual concept and a group concept backwards and forwards quite interesting, because growth mindset is very much an individual concept.
Yes.
It is, I can have a growth mindset, you can have a growth mindset, but we together, our organization doesn't. But that's what Satya Nadella talked about. We as Microsoft are going to become an organization with a growth mindset, and it was saying a lot of the same types of things, like the symptoms of establishing either psychological safety or growth mindset were considered to have the same outcome. When I've been looking at this, and if you compare what Google was saying and what Microsoft was saying, I think it's fascinating to think that the growth mindset, just like trust, growth mindset is really an individual capacity to learn and adapt and be open to experience, and improvement. So to take that experience and improve off the back of it. One of the reflections that I had is a requirement in a team setting for you to be able to have a growth mindset, to be allowed by your team, your peers, your managers to have a growth mindset, is psychological safety. So one of the interplays between those two concepts was, I found it really interesting to consider that to individually demonstrate a growth mindset and to have this sort of organizational growth mindset, you need to establish as a prerequisite psychological safety, because without that, safe to challenge, lack of fear of showing vulnerability in a group setting, you can't have a growth mindset. You can, because you'd have to extract yourself out of the culture to demonstrate a growth mindset.
Yeah. And also, in the reverse, you could have a group of 6 people or a team of 6 people who all individually hold growth mindsets, but they may not have team psychological safety.
Yeah.
So it works in two directions, which is why, like you said, I think the idea, you take that kind of vision of the organization is going to have a growth mindset, that sounds brilliant. That sounds really exciting, and like it could have a positive effect. The devil's in the detail, and you must handle with care the translation of a concept that's developed as an individual idea, and then just taking it wholesale and considering it to be applicable to a different level of analysis as it would be in a team. You know, Richard Hackman called that the cross-level fallacy of
Yeah.
assuming something is neat and explains something to you at a certain level of analysis. That means it will perfectly help you understand something at a different level of analysis. Nonetheless, it does work, but
Yeah.
you need to, I think you need to retain the nuance of the work, for example, that Amy Edmondson did on, that we've already discussed, like the different dimensions of team psychological safety, understanding it. And Amy Edmondson's done a lot of work on team learning behavior, because ultimately what psychological safety is enabling you to do is understand your limits as a team and improve your performance by using challenge and setbacks and failures as those opportunities to improve. But some of those challenges come from within the team itself. So the
Yeah.
psychological safety isn't there, then you don't get that data because people aren't willing to share it.
One final part on that crossover between growth mindset and psychological safety in the teaming book. Amy Edmondson talks about some of her research where she was looking at surgical teams as
Mm.
opposed to the pharmaceutical teams, and she was talking about, I think it was 4 teams that were implementing a new surgical process
Yeah.
in different
Yeah.
organizations. Yeah, as I was reading it, I just felt that there were these enormous overlaps with what Matthew Syed was talking about in Black Box Thinking. So he contrasts airlines with the aviation industry with surgeons, and
Mm.
how you sort of get that fixed mindset with very senior surgical practitioners that if you get to the top of the tree, your opinion is everything, and so you will never admit that you've been wrong. The opposite, fixed mindset rather than growth mindset. And it was really interesting because when she is talking about her research into those studies, she is almost saying that she could observe within those groups that the leaders, specifically the leaders in the 2 less successful adoptions of this new surgical process, had fixed mindsets.
Yeah.
whereas the other two, the teams were more open to challenge. They had less experience, but they were actually much more successful with the adoption of those surgical procedures.
That reinforces that idea of leadership is so pivotal to
Yeah,
establishing psychological safety. I'm reminded of a story a doctor told me, consultant female doctor, saying when she asks a male more senior consultant for their input on a decision, what she has realized, and I'm not trying only to make this about gender, although I think that gender plays a significant part in this story, but there's also a thing about psychological safety and belief about what kind of atmosphere and climate are you modeling in the response to questions and input from your colleagues. When she asks for input from a more senior consultant, not even though she's a consultant herself, what she's realized is the senior consultant believes she is asking them for the answer, not for input.
yeah,
So when they give her the quote unquote answer and she does something different, they take offense to it.
yeah,
And that's a really nice demonstration of a lack of trying to foster psychological safety, because you're engaging in the conversation on the basis that that you're not safe to ask for help. Actually, you're I'm just going to give you the answer and you're going to do what I tell you. Before we move on to finally talking about that idea of safe to challenge in the contemporary context, it's a really nice book by an academic called Tim Clark. And what he did was he developed an idea of progression of stages of psychological safety. And I think this sets us up to talk about safe to challenge really
yeah,
nicely, because rightly, his experience and his research demonstrate that, yeah, so like you were saying earlier, Mark, you can say, well, Google says the way to success in a team is to have psychological safety, so let's just have that.
yeah,
Let's go get ourselves some psychological safety. What Tim Clark's work does really nicely is demonstrate how you nurture the levels of psychological safety towards the point where it's really functioning at a high level and getting you the value that you need to get from it. The first level of the four is inclusion safety. And he's talking about, well, you actually just need to, you need, I suppose the common throwaway line is, well, you need to feel seen, but it's not so much that as he talks about you need to feel that your worth as a human being is being noticed and appreciated, not your worthiness, not our how much we value you is contingent on what you do. It's just no baseline. You're accepted. You're in the team. You belong here, and you demonstrate your behaviors, demonstrate and reinforce that belief that everybody's welcome, and you need to start with that, and you need to make a considered effort to develop inclusion before you move on to any of the fun stuff. You
yeah,
know, um, after that, interesting on the basis of what we've just been talking about with growth mindset, is learner safety. So once you feel genuinely included, you then feel safe to learn. And that's where that thing of asking for help, asking silly questions, being vulnerable of about your the limits of your understanding or knowledge. Learner safety gives you permission to share those insecurities, asking for feedback, all of those sorts of things. So, as an academic, that's something I think about in the classroom. I need to start with trying somehow to foster a sense of inclusion, to get my students to the point where they feel comfortable enough to ask questions and comfortable enough to say, I don't understand this, or
yeah,
can you go over that again? I don't get it. Then so that's learner safety level 2. Then it's contributor safety. So then it's about feeling safe to get involved. In an organizational team setting, it's about a bit of autonomy and agency around about fulfilling your role. So once you've got to that point of you feel safe to you feel included, you feel safe to ask questions and show your ignorance, receive feedback, and kind of get going, then it's about, right, you've now got this sense of autonomy and agency, that and empowerment, that you can kind of uh, express yourself in the role that you have and you're part of the team. And only once you've gone through inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, do you get to the golden challenger safety.
Yeah.
That's the once you've achieved all those other stages, that's when you can stick your head above the parapet to challenge the status quo, where you feel like, yeah, I am permitted to question things, to offer constructive criticism and dissent, to question the way we do things around here, to question the culture perhaps, without fear of retribution, admonishment, or being shut down. And that's the thing that fascinates me about the obsession. I think there is a bit of an obsession these days. In It's almost trendy. It's like, we're an organization where it's safe to challenge, and that gets banded about, and it becomes an initiative led by senior management saying, we want our junior people to be safe to challenge. That is an admirable goal. I would never say, oh, that's misguided, because that's good, but it's perhaps poorly framed in terms of an ambition, because one of the issues, given all the things we've discussed today about the complexity of psychological safety, the fact that it is developed gradually, it's nurtured, and what Tim Clark talks about is that it's developed in these quite specific layers that have to come one after another. If you focus on the challenge, you're focusing on the sharp end, and actually, my opinion is you could almost do the opposite. You could actually be creating an atmosphere where you're making it less psychologically safe.
Yeah.
Because if you're almost not, I don't mean this, you're doing it deliberately, but putting such an emphasis on the challenge, people might feel under considerable pressure to
Yeah.
speak up. They might almost feel bullied into, or kind of harassed into saying, "Well, I'm supposed to, like, I'm in this meeting. I think I'm supposed to be telling people that I don't agree with it, so I'm going to challenge it." And if that challenge is being launched in an environment where there is no psychological safety, there will be a very strong reinforcement of a message that says, you're not safe to do this. And the issue is that, even worse than that, is the leaders who, if they're misguidedly setting that as an agenda, they will see the evidence that it's working. They say, well, people are challenging, so we've got psychological safety.
Yeah.
But you don't. And my analogy to this is, the focus is on the wrong bit. If we go back to those levels of psychological safety, or stages of psychological safety: inclusion, learner, contributor, challenger, you should be focusing on the inclusion. And actually, to some extent, I don't mean this in such a black and white way, but to some extent, you shouldn't ever need to, or you shouldn't overly need to stress your expectation of challenging. You should focus on the inclusion, and the challenging will happen naturally. And it's a bit like, the problem with focusing on the challenge is, it's a bit like a comedian in a comedy club being like, well, this audience is rubbish. They're not laughing at my jokes.
Yeah.
I need to tell them to laugh more. There's not enough laughter. I want the evidence that I am funny is when people laugh. So I need to tell them to laugh more at my jokes. No. You need to write funnier jokes. You
Yeah.
need to focus on your joke writing, not what the audience are doing. And that's one of the difficulties with taking too much of a focus, I think, on the challenger safety, is sort of missing the point.
We heard that in the example that I shared earlier around the Colombia situation. They're saying that on the walls,
Yeah,
there
yeah,
are literally signs saying, if it's unsafe, you have to say. But people didn't feel safe, particularly the engineer that might have prevented the disaster didn't feel safe sharing above a certain tier. I think that actually leads quite neatly into maybe talking about how you can implement some of the things that lead to psychological safety, but also how it gets misused as well. I know that you've experienced some of that firsthand, particularly with safe to challenge, around how that sense that you're getting told you have to be safe to challenge can have a skewed effect when it's actually being passed down inside the organization.
Yeah, I did some work with the civil service, and I know that in the UK civil service, I know that in the UK civil service there is quite a an effort culturally to there's an ambition to develop a sense of being safe to challenge, again, which is admirable and understandable. But a question I had on one of the sessions that I did with civil servants was, oh, we have, from a member of the team, it wasn't from someone in a leadership position per se, saying, we have this thing about being safe to challenge. And if I can summarize, this person felt really uncomfortable about it. So the concept of safe to challenge was stressing them. Um, and it comes back to that idea of, well, if you're being told to challenge in a climate that lacks psychological safety, that's the worst of both worlds. And you could see that even going further, the word itself, so think of my kind of linguistics slant here, but the word challenge itself had almost become toxic. It become impossible to use because it represented so many difficult things for the people who were being encouraged to do the challenging, that they almost, when they heard the word safe to challenge, it felt like it's a bit like that resilience gets banded around. You need to be more resilient. There's a bit of a victim blaming thing about resilience. Well, the problem is just people aren't resilient enough. So
Yeah.
you need to challenge more. You could interpret it as passively sort of doing a bit of by proxy victim blaming of, well, we'd all be in much more psychologically safe atmosphere if you just challenged more.
There is a really interesting overlap, and I don't want to spend too long on it, but I always find it really interesting around the Kim Scott book, Radical Candor. I think encouraged lots of people to try to focus on feedback, and there's a lot of great material in that book. But the flip side of that is I saw the concept of radical candor being adopted. This typical thing of here is a concept, and then managers or leaders get hold of it and slightly twist it to their own use. I saw radical candor getting used really as a way of bullying, because the culture didn't exist that would allow that type of feedback. So radical candor talks about how it is better for the organization and for the individual to hear feedback, for you not to obscure that. But I think that is easily misused. And again, probably a requirement for radical candor is psychological safety in the environment, and especially crossing those hierarchical boundaries, because I think it's easy. One of the points that I wanted to make that I always think is really, really important when you look at teams and you look at the impact of seniority on those teams, there is an almost invisible to the person in the leadership role, the leverage of their position is incredibly impactful on the people below it. We saw it with the Columbia example, but it is very easy for a leader to think, oh, I'm modeling these behaviors, but even a slight deviation away from demonstrating that this is an environment where people are safe to challenge, or that they indeed themselves are vulnerable, which I think is really important, has a massively leveraged impact on the people within the team. So receiving some feedback from a peer is uncomfortable. Receiving feedback from a manager or a manager of a manager is that much tougher. And I think it's really easy to be outside of that environment and believe that this is fine. I've said that we need to be psychological safe, so we are. So I can give direct feedback, and everybody will just accept it in the spirit that it's given. But you're missing so much about the way that the culture actually is, and also not fully understanding the importance of the hierarchy in the way that that's received.
And there's nuance to it because now we're getting into so what actually happens, and the the other side of it is there's the challenge, right? So we're talking about safety challenge. It needs to be in a psychologically safe environment. If you challenge a superior on a decision or the way that we do things around something, and for very good reason, that challenge isn't going to result in the change that the substance of the challenge might suggest was what you were looking for, that doesn't mean that there's no psychological safety. It's about how that response is handled. So I think there's another. So the two-way street of the it's so incumbent on people in leadership positions to handle the asymmetry of the power that they hold in these sorts of scenarios with real care and understand. It's a bit like, parenting. You're like, you need to perform this role of it's okay. I appreciate that you've said this, and it might feel a bit fake, but it's so important. Actually, there's a way of doing it sincerely. But the thing that my point is that you need to make sure that there's a soft landing for a
Yeah,
response that might not be what the person's looking for in their challenge, because I think there's a sometimes I wonder if there's a missing word, because it's about safe to challenge, it's about safety to unsuccessfully challenge.
yeah,
And the safety to unsuccessfully challenge is about what happens after you've challenged and how you are able to then regroup and engage in dialogue after that. Because if you feel, right, I felt completely comfortable raising my voice and saying, I don't think this is the right way to do things, the equally important second half of that equation is I continue to feel safe to do that again, even though I know and understand why the thing that I said hasn't been taken forward. Because I do think, yes, there's the responsibility on the leader, but a psychologically safe environment also means that the person doing the challenging is completely clear in the fact that it doesn't mean that when they open their mouth, the thing that they want to happen will happen. That's not
yeah.
psychological safety. And you talked about Amy Edmondson said it's not about being nice. No, it's not about being nice, and it's not about getting your way all the time. That's a bit of the puzzle that needs equal amounts of attention, because I think as well a leader who's not involved in cultivating psychological safety will also think, well, they've challenged me, great, I'll shut them down now. We're psychologically safe because they did the challenging bit and I can now just carry on the way that I wanted.
Like, heard. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I think that leads nicely on for us. Just if we talk about maybe some of the misunderstandings and misconceptions. So you just mentioned that concept that sort of a misconception is being safe to challenge is the thing, and then everything else will fall under it. But actually, that creates much more pressure. One of the ones that I've seen, or a couple that I've seen, I've definitely seen the misunderstanding of psychological safety as being an environment where performance isn't important. So, where psychological safety is the most important thing and performance comes a distant second. So, in that instance, I have seen team members misunderstand that it is the most important thing for them to come to do their job and to make sure it's a nice culture for everybody to be in, and that comes first, and that actually delivering anything comes second. So you can actually see, well, we couldn't push for a deadline, or we couldn't exert ourselves particularly hard because that wouldn't be psychologically safe. And I think that's certainly one of the misunderstandings that I've seen, that it is at the detriment of performance to enable psychological safety, where I think that is definitely not true. Both of those things can exist. You can definitely have a high performance culture with strong psychological safety, and although they might be linked, you would actually expect performance to go up in a highly safe environment. One of the other ways that I've seen it misused is almost as a personal shield, and I think this one can be particularly troubling, where you can find that somebody um, can object to some feedback that they've had. So maybe they're being told that their performance, could be the entire team isn't performing, and that individual is responding on behalf of the whole team, perhaps in private, or it could be that their own personal contribution has been criticized, and they come back and saying, well, I don't feel psychologically safe. So this is the red flag that they wave, that they feel is going to be the ticket that they get to complain about the organizational culture. And again, that's not really the point of this. This is not saying that you will not be criticized. It's actually quite the opposite. It's trying to create an environment where you are potentially going to hear things that are uncomfortable. And you might even be fired because your performance isn't good enough. And that's really unfortunate, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't a psychologically safe environment. That actually just means that your performance wasn't sufficient to do the job.
Yeah, and I think there's potential for a kind of disingenuous deployment of, well, this is just evidence that this is not a psychologically safe working environment, and that's why I'm being targeted, when it may be happening in a place which has successfully fostered a psychologically safe team dynamic. So it can be weaponized like any of these things, and I often think one of the things to look out for there is if it is conscripted into being something that that person owns. So that defense is like, I do not feel psychologically safe. This, therefore, is evidence of lack of psychological safety in this team. Therefore, you're a bad leader. And you go back to Edmondson's work, it's not owned by any individual. So it doesn't mean, look, if that's the reaction that someone has, the sentiment could be accurate. There's nothing in someone saying that tells you one way or the other, because it's to do with context of the team. But it's possible that by conscripting it into the individual, the sort of individual perspective, is missing the point. So it's about an aggregate level of shared beliefs about what the team climate is like, and one person on one occasion claiming, because I don't like the feedback I've received, means this is not psychologically safe. It is not evidence of a lack of psychological safety. So it should, you can, I don't want to say you should treat any comment like that with a pinch of salt.
Well, indeed you can't. I think the issue becomes that it does become a flag that people feel that they can wave. You have criticized me, and therefore this isn't psychologically safe, which then calls into question the team environment. Whereas that certainly shouldn't be the case. There were two other misconceptions or misunderstandings that I wanted very quickly to mention at the manager level. One is, there is no single measure of psychological safety. Even if we could dip a thermometer into a team and take a reading on how psychologically safe it was, that is not really indicative. And part of the reason for that is every individual within that environment is going to have a different feeling, like a different concept of how psychologically safe it is for them. Some of that is temporal. It takes time to feel safe in that environment. But there's a lot more factors to that. In fact, I've got an episode coming out where we're going to talk about personality, but personality is a really big part of that. Very confident people are more likely to feel psychologically safe. People that score higher on neuroticism and constantly question themselves are more likely to feel that they are not in a safe environment, and so need extra work to try and demonstrate to them that actually this is a safe space. So there is no one size fits all, even in a small team. You cannot just say this is psychologically safe or not safe. It may be for some and not for others, and so you need to keep working on it. The other thing that I wanted to mention quite quickly, it's really around your point of inclusivity, but was just as a note for managers, that psychological safety is not just procedural. It's not just cultural or modeling from a manager. Some of it is structural as well. So you talked about the steps to get to the challenger safety. Learning safety is part of that. As an indication, it's much easier for somebody to come into an environment as a learner and have someone else learning at the same time as them. So if you're structuring a team, if you're thinking about, here is my team, I'm going to have people that are very, very capable, they're experts, they're senior people within the team, senior practitioners within the team, and there is one junior person, it's going to feel very different for that junior person to the senior people. So you can actually address some of that structurally by trying to make sure there's always two learners in a team, or there is a constant progression path, because then people are much more sympathetic to the states and can see reflected other people. It's the sense that I'm a learner, I have a buddy that I am learning at the same time of, and we can experience these things together. Some of those things, some of the structural work that you can do on a team as a manager, can actually help create a much more inclusive environment. So if you're the only woman in an all-male team, maybe it doesn't feel as safe for you as it does for the men. So there's lots of criteria where you can look at that and say, well, actually, what can we as an organization be doing to make sure that the structural environment for those teams to perform actually helps create that atmosphere.
Yeah, that is the self-reflection element for people in positions of leadership is vital. And your example of someone potentially, someone on the receiving end of negative feedback around performance, saying, this is not a psychologically safe team. As I said, that statement could be true or false depending on the context. But certainly, I would always say, if you're in that position of leadership, that's a good question to ask yourself: is what are the dynamics around this person's experience of psychological safety in the team? Because that idea of it being an aggregate shared belief at the team is true. There's research out there that is trying to work out, but what does that actually mean? Because aggregate is a number that doesn't belong to any one individual. Someone who's high in neuroticism may experience a lower level of psychological safety than someone who's very open to new experiences and less neurotic. But the person in the position of leadership needs to do a good bit of self-reflection, thinking, have I set a climate of inclusion? Is this person feeling the way that I want them to feel when they're on the receiving end of feedback? In a perfect psychologically safe world, that person will understand why they're receiving whatever feedback they may be receiving, good, bad, or indifferent. Retaining your focus on maintaining that is very worthwhile, and that's something that Edmondson talks about, modeling vulnerability. We talked to Alina Kessel in our episode when we interviewed her, and she talked about, as a senior leader in a global organization, about modeling fallibility and being willing to be open about your personal vulnerabilities. And a bit like that idea of parenting, the people who are looking up to you, they see what you're doing, and the fact that you're doing it is giving implicit permission to behave in that way. So if a leader is never showing any weakness and never accepts uh, things where they've fallen short of expectations or where they've been unsuccessful or whatever, then they are modeling that to the team. They're saying it is not okay to fail. It is not okay to share the mistakes that you've made or the problems you've encountered. And those sow the seeds of a low psychological safety environment.
You just gave this great example of modeling, and for me, that's definitely my number one tip, but especially at a leadership level. I think within the organization, it is clearly not sufficient just to put on a wall, if it's not safe, then say so. We heard about that in the space shuttle disaster scenario in Amy Edmondson's book in Teaming. One of the things that I wanted to call out from that, particularly in that modeling, and we talked about hierarchy, is she gives an example of where the leader within that mission control setting that was responding to the potential disaster around the space shuttle, at one meeting stood up to kick off the meeting, and rather than inviting the lower ranking expert within that group to give an opinion, invited her second in command to step forward, but came out and gave an opinion. And that opinion wasn't necessarily based in the same amount of expertise as the more junior people in the team. I thought that was a really good example or anti-pattern of this modeling, where in that particular instance, the leader did not model an environment which was conducive to psychological safety, because she immediately established through the hierarchy, I'm going to go to my second in command first, rather than making this an open scenario for everybody to contribute to. We've talked about the outsize impact of hierarchy on the way that psychological safety is perceived, receiving criticism from somebody more senior, or actually witnessing vulnerability, as you mentioned with Alina in that previous episode. Modeling vulnerability is hugely important. And
Yeah.
I think it is important for leaders to really demonstrate constantly, to really overemphasize demonstrating that they are vulnerable, that they can make mistakes, that they are not infallible,
Yeah.
that they can be corrected, that they will take criticism. Uh, I think it is important as well for people to reflect, and just talking about that modeling and talking about the how people feel about psychological safety, that just saying this is a psychological safe environment doesn't mean that you can openly criticize people in that situation because it is psychologically safe, because actually it might be damaging in that situation. So everybody has to be mindful. You don't sit in the meeting and openly criticize your boss, or something that your boss is saying because you have a claim that it's psychologically safe. There might be a time that is better than an open forum to do that, and so there is always nuance in how you demonstrate that this is a psychologically safe environment.
That comes back to my point of there is a continuous two-way street on everyone's behavior. If you genuinely subscribe to the idea of being a member of a psychologically safe team, you can't only view it through your individual perspective. You have to consider, well, yes, it's psychologically safe, so I can speak up and say the boss is a dickhead.
Yeah,
But by expressing yourself in that way, you are potentially reducing the psychological safety for your teammates. So
yeah,
it you must always retain the two views, because you are a custodian of the psychological safety along with all of your counterparts, and you're the caretaker of it in everything that you do and say. That hopefully that doesn't make people feel too under pressure, but it's important that you always keep that in mind. I think exposing the practice of behavior that leads to psychological safety in small deal ways, because I think this could turn into propaganda, which you don't want, but taking the opportunity to highlight when someone has stuck their head above the parapet to question something and that has resulted in a change, or that time where I made a mistake, or that time where I got that wrong, in a low key way, trying to make reference to the evidence that there is psychological safety being retained within the team is good. Going too far the other way and making propaganda out of it can have its own issues, but being mindful of that modeling work, and like you say, fallibility, vulnerability, owning your mistakes, and making sure that people know about them as a person in leadership is important. On a kind of more inclusion level, another tip for me is really investing in familiarity, really investing in the fact that this is a human thing. Now I know there's debate about how much of yourself should you bring to work,
yeah.
but we have to bring some of ourselves, and the definition of a team involves relational and instrumental dynamics. So it's not just about the technical administrative dimensions of your job. It's about you as an individual, as a person, and in order to have a successful level of psychological safety, you need to have human relationships, and you only achieve those by engaging in experiences that allow you to interact beyond the technical aspects of your job. So having opportunities to become familiar with each other, and that does translate to the dreaded away days and things, but done well, it works.
Psychological safety exists in remote teams, and we've spoken a lot about how to make virtual teams work together. But bringing people together, go out for a meal, spend time that isn't on the work, is a really important part of building the social bonds between people, and those social bonds build interpersonal trust, and that interpersonal trust can extend out and strengthen the psychological safety.
Another thing that I think Tim Clark says that I think is useful, especially from a leadership point of view, is I think it can feel very high pressure, this whole thing about psychological safety. We need to be building it all the time. It's essential. It's hard to do. But I like what Tim Clark talks about in his book, which is to say, some contexts warrant it and necessitate it more than others. He talks about how when you're responding to a crisis, or you're responding to a threat, or some form of external situation, quite often what that results in is the need for permission to speak up is dealt with by the situation. So we're all dealing with a problem here. We know we know we need contribution. We know we need people to get involved. There's no need to question the status quo, because the status quo has hit us in the face with a problem. So we all know what the problem is and we're responding to it. And it's quite useful to distinguish, is this a situation where we're just in response to an incident mode? In which case, I don't really need to worry about protecting psychological safety, because actually there's quite a lot of implicit psychological safety created by the scenario. If you're in a more forward thinking context and you're planning into the future, strategizing, or it's a more general discussion, and that might give the opportunity for someone to question a process, question a decision, or suggest a way forward in the future that no one else had previously suggested. That's a scenario where you need to be switched on to retaining psychological safety, because that's the place where someone may be censoring themselves on the basis of not feeling comfortable speaking up.
My extension to that is there is no one size fits all. Situationally, one size doesn't fit all, but also within a team, within an organization, one size doesn't fit all. And so I think being very conscious that you can't just take something that has helped create psychological safety in one organization and bring it to another. Doesn't necessarily work. And that even within the context of one team, the team is constituted by the people within the team, and they will all have different responses to the ways that you're trying to create it. And so I think it's very important, as you have said before, to be willing to experiment. In all of these things, be willing to experiment. Don't assume that there is a checkbox exercise that just says,
Yeah.
in this environment, this is what you do to create psychological safety. You have to look at the situation, you have to look at the context, you have to look at the people, and then you have to try to create ways that come up with this culture, this sort of symptom of all of the things that have been created, which is psychological safety.
And that probably leads me to my final tip, which is, talks about experimenting, is Amy Edmondson talks about practice fields. It's a big thing in aviation, healthcare, simulation, all these sorts of um, initiatives that are precisely designed to give you the opportunity to learn and fail. So other words involved in psychological safety, but create practice fields. And in a regular, say, like a business setting, they might not be a simulator, but certainly, especially if you're in a position of leadership, I would say, can you identify opportunities that you could regard as spaces in which you could experiment? So there may be low stakes scenarios where you're going to be interacting with the team, but you can think about, how am I modeling fallibility here? And your career isn't on the line, or your promotion or your bonus isn't on the line. It's more, right, this is a chance for me to say, okay, I'm going to make a point of saying a thing that I got wrong, and I'm going to make a point of trying to elicit some input from more junior colleagues who I would normally not expect to feel brave enough to speak up. And thinking of those environments as practice fields means that when you really do need it, you've had a go of doing it. It won't feel, as a leader, it's not going to feel completely alien and uncomfortable. And you might get the vital input from a junior colleague who otherwise wouldn't have contributed had they not had that opportunity to contribute in a practice session.
For me, there is an element of don't talk about psychological safety. Don't create a slide deck that says we're going to become psychologically safe. I think actually having that practice is the thing that happens. So you don't say we're going to be psychologically safe. You say what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate some of these behaviors that will lead to it, and almost takes away some of that pressure of creating this thing, this object that you're trying to achieve of psychological safety, and instead saying that's hopefully going to come at some point in the future, but actually giving us an opportunity to practice modeling the behaviors, listening to the team, trying to understand the context and the responses from people and whether we're getting it right or wrong. You don't achieve psychological safety. You sort of achieve within that particular group, within that organization, within that context, the things that evidence that it exists. It's not something that you just flick a switch and you've done.
At a some kind of high level, you can probably roughly say the prevailing situation is that it exists. You can't point to it, and you can't say at any one given moment, "Oh, this is us doing psychological safety." It's not like that. And all you can do is try and, like, Richard Hackman talks about, you create the conditions. So that's why, going back to this idea of the difficulties with focusing on safe to challenge, it's the same problem. Is if you focus on the challenging, you're missing the point. The challenging should be a lagging consequence of the conditions that you've set. Well, that was quite a significant safari around from the 1950s of definition and background to the concept of psychological safety, through to the impact of Edmondson's work, how it then became turbocharged by Google's Project Aristotle, and bringing it home with this discussion around some of the difficulties of implementing psychological safety within modern teams, and maybe, could we call it, some of the misinterpretation of the elements of it? This idea of, safe to challenge, maybe getting the wrong end of the stick. But it's been fun to kick it about.
Yeah, it's absolutely great, and I love that interplay between all of the academic research that existed so long before Google, and like you say, then the supercharging. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for listening to this episode and for all your work in preparing, Andrew. And hopefully we'll see you all on the next episode.
Cheers, Mark. See you again.